I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. Welcome back, everybody. We are at our highly anticipated, because we're both nerds, segment of the podcast, which is on government, the right relationship of government, how government's supposed to function, how a government can be morally informed without being a theocracy. And all of those wonderful things. So Spencer, being the Hillsdale educated man that he is going to start us off with a brief summary of the role of government. What's it for? Why does it exist? Why was it instituted by God? And all of those good things. And we'll go from there. So Kuyper kind of started us off with the idea of sphere sovereignty, right? There's these specific areas in which these different parts of life exist, and that they're really not supposed to bleed over, but they are influenced by each other. So lead us off with the idea of the sphere of government. Where does it derive its power? Where does it come from? What is its right role?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into some of the ultimate questions there, right? That human beings wrestle with. I think at the very center of it all is because we're talking about what is justice? Is justice real? Are we all playing make-believe? Mm-hmm. Or is there actually a law that we all perceive and seek to conform to, and we seek to make our social and political orders conform to that law for the sake of justice and human flourishing and everybody living in right relationship with one another? If that is real, and that's where you have the connection between philosophy of politics and philosophy of religion. Yeah. So, but it's dealing with that central question. Now, you're inherently in murky waters because we're talking about invisible things that we can't see.
Right.
But they also make you could argue the most important. They make up components of the most important parts of the human experience. Mm-hmm. Right. So we're continually coming back to these things, and you wrestle with them in the political realm. You wrestle with them in the social realm. Going back to the institution of government, it is the means of enforcing and creating social order, right? Mm-hmm. But we all want our government to reflect a higher level of truth, which is why I'm always quick to point out government is the most idealistic of institutions.
Yes.
Because you're literally saying we're going to figure out what is good and just and right, and we're going to enforce that with force when necessary, right? So our modern society has really bought into this myth of like we're all morally neutral here.
Yeah, or morally good. Yeah.
We're all fine, and we're not even using a moral framework. In fact, we're all just completely like objective blank slates.
Yes.
And all the moral claims that we make are self-evident, and there's so many ways in which we're kidding ourselves and one another, and we all play along. But if we're not seriously pursuing this conversation and thinking through these really important things, at the end of the day, and this is what bothers me the most about where we're at today, societally, it's like everyone has this sense that we're all playing make-believe, right? Because you can either say justice is real, which means that there's a certain way in which you ought to treat human beings.
Right.
Because they're created in the image of God, say. And there are certain ways that you ought not to treat them to dishonor the inherent dignity that they have being made in the image of God. Or you say, we don't know about that stuff because after all, we're modern people and I don't see any of that under a microscope. But I would rather live in a society where people didn't lie to me and, back out of contracts, etc. Right. And I wish we all treated each other like we were special. At least I want to be treated like I'm special. Right. So let's build that kind of a world where I get treated the way I want to be treated. And some people, a lot of people, I think, if we don't get down into the weeds of it, they're like, well, what's the difference then, whether there's a God or we think there's an ontological basis for goodness, etc., versus we're all just plain make-believe. The minute we all succumb to the notion, the lie, that we're playing make-believe, we've automatically put ourselves in the God seat, right? We determine what is true and what is false. And who is we, after all, at the end of the day, right? Yeah. So the people that have their hands on the wheel of power, they are now in the God seat. They determine what justice is, what is true, what is false, whose lives have value, and which lives don't have value. And that's always going to be the line that exposes the gap between God as holy and just and right and perfect and loving versus human rulers, which always devolve into, pictures of corruption and abuse and tyranny.
Yeah, and I think it goes a few things there. One, talking about putting yourself in the God seat of the one who says what's right and wrong. When the Obergefell decision was in the news and everybody was talking about it, if I had $1 for that 1 year period, that every time somebody told me you can't legislate morality,
I know,
I would have owed the government so much money in taxes. It would have been ridiculous. Because that's exactly what legislation is, right? Legislation is morality. Legislation says, I will not steal from my neighbor. Legislation says, I will not abuse my spouse. My legislation says, I will give a certain amount of money every week when I get a paycheck, or every 2 weeks when I get a paycheck, to help take care of my neighbor, because we have said this is morally good as a society. And in the greatest country in the world, one of the richest countries in the world, we say it is unacceptable for a child to die of hunger today. Those are good things, right? And regardless of which way you push that legislation, you are affecting morality in one way, shape, or form. Even if we go to say, banking regulation, right? We were talking about this before the show. That sounds so official. Before we started recording, the idea of the predatory lending practices that led up to the 2008 financial crisis, right? The average American is not well versed in contract law. They are not well versed in home equities. They're not well versed in mortgages. They don't understand those processes, and they are being taken advantage of. Right? Brokers were lying and falsifying documents, and they were pushing people into these loans that they had no business being in, because the broker was getting a large piece of the pie. Right? They were getting a large fee for doing this, for initiating these loans. And so Americans were finding themselves upside down on their house, and it was heartbreaking how much they were being taken advantage of. That is a right role of government to step in and say, these predatory lending practices are wrong. You cannot lie to a consumer. You cannot tell them that this is going to be X percentage interest rate, and in reality it's this percentage rate because it's on a flexible schedule, right? Like, there are even things that we may look at and say on the face of them, we don't think this is a moral decision. It's all tied to morality. So that kind of begs the next question.
Even on the most cold numbers, math, economic stuff. Yeah, it comes back to, are you being honest?
Yes.
And are you operating with integrity?
Right.
Are you doing right by your neighbor?
Yes. Because that is where capitalism works well, is in a moral society where it's I am creating because in my creation I am redeeming. I am creating because it's part of my nature that was given to me by God. I'm creating because it is a good for society. It's good for the city. It's good for my neighbor. It's good for me.
Right.
We're making money off of that creation, but then we're also paying our people well, right? Like Henry Ford, he's not a model of moral virtue by any means, but when he started Ford Motor Company, he wanted to not only make a great product that provided a good use and a good benefit to the customer, he also wanted to pay his employees enough where they could stop being employees and become customers, right? That was part of his goal. He was removing the drudgery of work by creating the assembly line system. He was adding value and dignity to their efforts and to their skill. And he was paying the worker what his wages were worth, right? His worth and wages. And we don't see that today. We see large companies taking advantage of their employees, mass firings, mass layoffs. We're seeing the baseline income for a middle class family has actually gone down when you adjust for inflation over 60 years,
right,
as opposed to going up, right? And so that's a misuse of capitalism because it's funded by greed and not what good am I bringing to society and to the world. So all that to say, let's talk about...
And how many corporations, to that point,
Yeah.
do you see paying their labor force so poorly that they have to use supplemental government
Correct.
programs
Yes,
to take care of their household?
absolutely, which is shameful.
Yeah.
And there's no loyalty to the employee, right? There's no saying, hey, we're in this together. You're working with me on achieving this goal to bring this good to market. It's, I'm here to use you, and you're here to use me for a paycheck as long as I can provide one. And then when that's over, that's over. And we see companies focusing on the wrong things, right? Like take Boeing, for example. Boeing is an institution that has absolutely been devastated by DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, right? there's this great bit from Rob Schneider from a few years ago where he was actually talking about United Airlines and how United had said that it was their core policy to now hire based off diversity, right? How about we hire based off who can fly the plane the best, right?
Right.
And he says, man, I'm just so tired of arriving on time and safely with these white pilots. Like, this is ridiculous. We're changing the woke left has shifted these values, and they've said it's not about paying your guys well. It's not about paying your people appropriately and having that loyalty to them and bringing a good product to service. It's about how much social progress, social engineering can we push down people's throats. Going back to the Boeing piece, there's the great article that I was reading the other day was about this guy who was a quality control manager, and he basically just continued to get pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed until he was forced to take an early retirement. And they did not care about quality assurance. Like, the reason the quality assurance claims from the internal quality assurance, the number of times that they would file a claim saying this thing needs to be fixed, decreased was not because they were making things safer, but because they were bullying the people who were doing it into not submitting these assurance pieces.
Wow.
I mean, it makes me scared to fly on a Boeing plane. Like, I've never been concerned about these things, but I am becoming much more so. Like, he made it very clear that Boeing knew exactly why those two airlines that nosed into the ground in Africa and in I don't remember the other country that happened first, was because they absolutely knew that it was about a faulty piece of software, and they covered it up, and they made excuses, and they pushed out that grounding further and put more people's lives at risk. And so it's absolutely infuriating. So let's circle the wagon back to government and good government. So we're saying, the founder said...
Which is psychopathic, right?
Oh, it is.
To place profit and material gain ahead of the well-being of your consumers, correct, your fellow neighbors, the members of your community. It warps the manner of the relationship.
Yeah, and then say, look at us on how good we're doing with our DEI and how diverse of a company we are, and we're leading the way in this. And it goes back to the one of the best, in my opinion, one of the best ads to come out of the LGBTQ plus appreciation movement was this airline that had these 3 seatbelts, and they were lined up next to each other. It was a male connection, male-female connection, female-female connection. It says it doesn't matter how you connect. And it said, no, it does, because the other two don't work, right? The other two do not function. This is now void.
It's a meme gone wrong.
It is, and it's a blindness. So let's circle the wagons back. So the founders, talked about the fact that we're a nation founded on the laws of nature, and nature's God, right? So there's this,
which is them saying this justice thing is real,
right?
Which in their context means Parliament and the King of England are
unjust,
omnipotent unto themselves.
Yes,
they are subject to a higher standard.
Yes, which harkens back to that Magna Carta, right? Yeah. So it's the American system is very well founded in natural law and in British common law, right? Which doesn't in Great Britain, it's very much more connected, right? Because they have the Church of England and all of that. Yeah. But it's still saying that there's an objective. Ravi Zacharias, with all of his baggage now, one of the examples he gave that I thought was great was that if you say that there is right and there's wrong, then that requires an objective truth. And if there is an objective truth, then there's an objective truth giver. The question is, who is it, right?
Yep.
And we can disagree on who it is, but we can't disagree on the fact that it exists.
Right.
Because we can, if we disagree on the fact that it exists, and that puts us in very opposed corners, and we cannot reconcile those differences, right?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who do now. They think that's so messy getting involved in that whole discussion. And it seems much cleaner and simpler to be like, probably none of this stuff exists, and we'll functionally be nihilists.
Yes.
But we'll be optimistic nihilists and say we could actually build something that's pretty cool with civilization. And again, we're just playing make-believe.
Right. And we'll build something that's cool with civilization, and we'll allow, doctor-assisted suicide in Oregon for, 25, 30 years? Right, and we'll have late-term abortions, and we always look to Europe and say, "Man, Europe is so progressive and so socialized. We need to be more like Europe." And then we look at Europe and their abortion laws is it's illegal to have them over 12 weeks.
Way more conservative than we are.
Way more conservative.
Yeah,
because they're not lying to themselves, right? And that's the problem is when we remove that objective truth, it's not like there's a vacuum. There is a vacuum. It's not like nothing can exist there, right? Like one morality is gone, another morality is brought in. if the question is which morality you're going to have. So how do we have a strong morality and a strong moral base without being a theocracy?
Well, the hope of the American founders was that we could be reasonable people, right? Like in very literally, like people with a high sense of reason and a capacity to educate themselves, to have these hard conversations. Because, like, just look at the Declaration of Independence. You have there a perspective, right, being articulated that reflects a type of synthesis. You're at a crossroads. You're talking about the political norms in English tradition, common laws you're talking about. And you're talking about something that is somewhat genuinely revolutionary, like this idea of a right to revolution, which comes out in, you know, the Enlightenment era.
Right.
And it gains steam in England, and you have the English Civil Wars, which inform a lot of this. But, you know, these arguments are being tested out, and the American Founding Fathers end up making this case that at a certain point, not at the first sign of malfeasance on the part of your government, right?
Right.
Prudence demands that you swallow a lot in an attempt to maintain peace and harmony and unity. But at a certain point, after a long train of usurpations, right, has come to pass, proving basically the ill will of your those who have been placed in authority over you, to the point that they are no longer acting in that vein of right authority, which is another, like, you can draw a line between this and even like Romans 13. And when the scripture is talking about governments, it acknowledges the role the government plays to bear the sword. And it talks about the authority government bearing being a reflection of the higher law of God. Right. Which is where you also get, you know, more Enlightenment types that are making a strong revolution case, saying when government strays outside of its right purpose and due authority, it becomes an agent of tyranny and oppression and chaos.
Right.
It is undermining the good of the society and the people who do have a fair claim to appeal to justice and a higher justice than this tyrant is providing. And so at a certain point, you also get to like Augustine and his argument about Christian just war theory.
Right.
Now, a big part of that that you see present in the early church, Christians in Rome, they're not thinking about starting a revolution because they know they can't win. Right? And that's a big part of Augustine's just war theory, which is if you don't have a feasible pathway to victory and your resistance is only going to produce more bloodshed, then you actually have a moral obligation to submit, right? And resist peacefully, in whatever way, kind of like Daniel in the Old Testament, right?
Sure.
He's not going to stage a revolution. He knows he can't win, but he's not going to comply. So you have this pattern of civil disobedience within Christianity. But later on, when you get to Christendom and a Christian West, and Christian nations, and now like the American Revolution, perfect example. On the one hand, it does seem crazy to pick a fight with the British Empire, and yet we won. So it's not a violation of just war theory if you win, right?
right. It's only treason if you lose, George Washington.
It's funny how that works out. Now, anyway, you have good Christians on both sides, some that are saying, I could never contemplate participating in revolution. That's a bridge too far for me, conscience-wise. And others saying, actually, I feel duty-bound, conscience-bound, to not turn a blind eye to what I see as blatant denial of the ancient laws of England, the customs of the realm, the rights of Englishmen, and all this stuff that basically is, you know, writ large. It's like, do we turn a blind eye to injustice when it pops up in our time? And many strong Christians said, no, I feel duty-driven to stand up and fight back. And that's exactly the voice of the Declaration of Independence, right? At a certain point, we feel compelled, morally compelled. And it's a moral claim, right? They're not saying, let's play make-believe, we can build a better mousetrap, and watch us. Our economy will be amazing.
Absolutely.
They're saying there's actually a moral factor to this that is key to the whole equation. And so institution of government, if there is any, if there's a real reason to take government seriously, because you always have like, the nonconformist and libertarian voice in the back of your head that's like, where do these people come from? Who put them in charge?
Right.
This is my mom. Why do I have to listen to them? If there is a reason to take government seriously, I think the biblical account of that makes the most sense. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, it tempers the authority of government. It doesn't make, the head of state God on earth.
Right.
It very much limits them, and it very much funnels their power, towards a higher purpose, justice, right, and serving their people well, and serving the cause of virtue over vice, etc. But you also have, the same scripture that limits the role of the state, encouraging Christians to submit to those that God places over us in authority, in authority over us, and that is a beautiful, balanced way to approach this difficult tension that you see between the church, between the state, between Christians and unjust rulers, etc. Right. But the biblical account, I would argue, makes the most sense. It's the most practical way to approach this whole dilemma, because it acknowledges the valid role that government plays because justice really exists. Right. And when governments do their job well, it serves people beautifully. Mm-hmm. But when governments do not view themselves as under the authority of God, you see them do indescribable damage. Right. And create hellscapes on earth.
Yeah, and I think a great example of that, looking at the revolutions, is you can compare the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, and the American Revolution, right? And the French and Russian are just absolute bloodbaths. Yeah. And they end up claiming just about everybody who started them, right? What comes around goes around in horrific ways. In the American Revolution, most of the atrocities were being committed by the British, right? It was not the Americans weren't going on this reign of terror to tell people that if you don't revolt with us, we're gonna come after you and your family.
We did get pretty good at tarring and feathering. Some tax collectors,
and some people would say that's justified. It just depends on who you talk to.
It's exactly what Jesus did to Matthew when he saw him,
right? And Zacchaeus, right? That was very obvious biblical examples. No,
I'm not saying that our hands were perfectly clean, and also,
and I'm not either. But
we all have the picture of the Patriot, right, in our head, and that's not historically accurate.
Correct.
To Britain's credit.
Yes.
But you're right. Like these are our neighbors.
Right.
These are the people that we've been living next door to.
Yep.
For
that we've been
30
conquering
years.
a new world with.
We're not gonna be total barbarians to them. Now, you do have some unfortunate instances of loyalists being put on a ship and sent to Canada. Yeah. Which is how some of my family members ended up in Canada.
Right. Well, and that's okay, because Canada is not the worst place to be. I mean, it's getting close, but it's not there yet.
Sent them up to Halifax.
Yeah, our neighbors.
So I'm actually, I don't know if I told you this. I'm related to L.M. Montgomery.
Oh, really?
The author of Anne of Green Gables, right? Yeah. That whole thing, and which is in Prince Edward Island,
right?
The island off of Canada.
Yeah.
The family got there because they had been in New England, but they were packed up and shipped out.
Man.
Around the Revolution.
But see, if you'd been in France, they would have all been killed.
So I guess that's to your point. Like, if the Patriots hadn't sent them away, we wouldn't have Anne of Green Gables.
Right. Yeah, I think the goals were different too, right? Like the French goals of equality, liberty, and brotherhood, right, are great on paper, and they sound nice. But then...
they sound great in your make-believe world.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's not feasible, and it's not, without a moral basis, it doesn't have any reason to exist.
Well, what do we mean when we say these things?
Right.
Whatever we mean, Robespierre is out here killing thousands upon thousands of people every day, the streets running red with blood. Mm-hmm. Is that a picture of fraternity?
No. And the mob's excited about it, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's also the...
And scared stiff, right, to speak against it, because that could be you.
Just like with Stalin, right?
If you're not a friend of the revolution, you're an enemy.
Yes. It's like with Stalin, that first time that he got up to speak, and nobody would stop clapping because they didn't want to get killed. Right? So then he created this hand sign that he would do whenever he was like, okay, that's enough, you can sit down now, so that everybody knew it was safe to stop clapping. Like... it's insanity. It's absolute insanity.
All to feed a human ego.
Correct.
Yeah.
And there's just been this disconnect where the left has said we'll ignore all of those side effects. We'll ignore all of that baggage because if we just try it one more time, it'll work.
You mean like having a positive spin on socialism?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and communism and the whole gambit, the whole social engineering gambit, right?
Well, the reason why they continually find themselves boxed into that corner is because, if you view the cosmos in such a way that God is irrelevant,
Right.
He's not really an active player here. Mm-hmm. Where is progress? How are we going to make our make-believe world better?
Yeah.
Right? Well, it's going to be through human ingenuity, and it's going to be through the institutions of power that have the power to affect change. And so the government's the obvious thing to turn to as the ability to make people do things at the point of a gun if necessary, right. And it can collect all the money it needs to. Mm-hmm. So they're always going to run back to the state as being the agent of progress.
Right.
And the creator, the recreator, right, of the world as we wished it were, which I often just... let's call it what it is. We're recreating the world in our image.
Right.
And it never, ever works.
Mm-hmm.
It always runs into a really hellish direction the minute we really try to sink our teeth into utopia. Mm-hmm. Because you will, it's easy to justify the means.
Right.
When your end is utopia.
Oh, absolutely. And I think going back to our that was a great tee up. I don't know if you meant it or not for our pre-recording conversation on Woodrow Wilson, right? So one of Woodrow Wilson's top advisor was a guy named William Mandel House. He wasn't actually a colonel, but they called him colonel. He wasn't, to my knowledge, he was not a Kentucky colonel, which is really the only colonels that matter if you're not in the military. But they called him Colonel House, and he wrote this book called Philip Drew Administrator. And you can't buy it anymore. You can find like I did. I found a copied, page by page copied version that was a PDF.
Wow.
And it's basically this outline of a utopian society, all run by Philip Drew, the administrator. And he was the administrator of this great society, and it was an absolute... He would say utopian paradise. I would say dystopian hell, like Peter Pan, right? Peter Pan is not a utopian. It's a
6 of 1.
Yeah. Anyway, so he so House had this game plan, and if you look at it, some of the key pieces of it was stuff that Wilson was pushing, right?
Yeah.
Whether it was the League of Nations, ended up with Treaty of Versailles, and that's why he was the leader in the eugenics movement. He desegregated offices. This massive racist. And yet he claimed to be a Christian. He came out of the academic world, right?
Yeah.
So there was this idea that if it works on paper, then it works in practice, and we can create this fantasy land that is here and good for everyone. That ended up having massive consequences for millions of people, right? Adolf Hitler came into power in the 30s, looks across the pond at the history of Wilson and says, "Man, this guy had some great ideas. Let's start this concentration camp. Like let's use this eugenics and let's take it to the next level and use it here in Germany."
We have to be honest, like how common the eugenics logic was.
Oh, and it's right back in vogue, right? Now it's CRISPR babies, and let's design our future. It's sex selective abortions with IVF. It is absolutely rearing its head again.
Yeah. Oh, and also on the Wilson thing, it's not like Wilson was actively advocating for death camps per se, but he's. I think what the Germans looked and saw in him is like, this is a guy who gets the administrative state thing, and he's implementing it in America. And of course, where did we get that from? We got it from German political theorists, right, in the Frankfurt School. So it's kind of
it's a German cycle.
The circle of patting each other on the back.
Right.
So you get that in America, and Hitler just brings it all to its fruition in Germany.
And it's an elitist view, right? It's an elitist view of we're the best, and because we're the best, we have the right to say who isn't, and we have the right to say who doesn't have dignity, who doesn't deserve dignity, and it's rooted in pride, and I don't think it's rooted in anything good. The birth control movement and the population control movement that was fed by the Warren Buffetts and the Bill Gates and all of that stuff. We need to control the population of these developing countries because it's bad for the environment. Like, how is that not just such a warped view of society of who is here to serve what? Is the environment here to serve man, or is man here to serve the environment, right?
Yeah. I think one reason why progressives keep falling into this pit is because, if they're hearing us talk and making fun of the idea of pursuing utopia, they might point out, like, well, why not shoot for the moon? Like, why not pursue the best thing? If you're not, then what are you doing? Are you actively throwing gasoline on the fire? Or are you just cold and heartless and, like, you don't even care? And sometimes those are exactly the kind of attacks that you hear lobbed against the church. Like, you're escapist, you don't really care about the poor, you say you're pro-life, but you don't care about women, etc. And I would just say this is the difference between ideology taking root versus rationality and a genuine, humble, honest pursuit of truth.
Correct.
Right? The ideological approach is, like you said, build my system on paper, right? These are my moral rules of my make-believe world.
Right.
If we're going to build a better mousetrap, this is what it's going to look like. And I truly believe this can get us to the utopia. Now, the problem is always, it's not really that you're trying to get to utopia.
Right.
Like, I look forward to the recreation of heaven and earth and Jesus reigning. And, like, it's going to be great. And I'm going to be very excited about that. The problem with humans trying to create utopia here now is what your diagnosis of the problem is.
Correct.
What is the problem exactly? Oh, it's the Jews.
Yes.
Okay, so we burn them all, and then utopia magically happens. Oh, it's not the Jews. It's the disabled. It's the elderly.
Yeah.
It's whatever we think is holding us back in terms of, like, they're useless eaters, as Hitler said.
Yeah.
They're not contributing enough, or they are, part of a systemic problem that's going on in society. Like, whatever it is. The fact that you're driving towards utopia means you're really saying that what we have right now is hell.
Right.
And you will go to great lengths to purify it. Now, who are the people that you're going to burn on the way to purify this?
Right.
And that's why it always results in mass casualties of, innocent civilians at the hands of their own state.
Right. No, that's great. And I think it goes back to a like you said, misdiagnosis of the problem and a incorrect ordering of priorities. You said it at the beginning, it's putting yourself in the God seat, right? It's saying that we can look over the course of human history and we can see, based off objective truth, things that are morally right, things that are morally wrong. We can look at natural law. We can look at historic common law. These well-vetted, these well-understood ideas that transcend time, place, community. And we have even if you're not willing to say that I believe in God, but you're willing to, you have to really be ignorant to say that these schools of thought and these schools of law are not valid, right? We may disagree on who God is, but we can't disagree on the way that objective truth works and interacts with reality. And when you have that person that says, let's take the human rights campaign, right? Human rights are core to that Judeo-Christian worldview, that every person is made in the dignity and likeness of God. And
which is why you seek to love your neighbor, serve your neighbor, reach the lost and save their soul.
Right.
Because they matter.
Absolutely. And anybody that we would say is a Christian is, in sin or living in a way that's not in accordance with Scripture. We do that not from a place of judgment and we're better and they're wrong. We do it from a place of brokenness and love, right?
It is not.
They're missing the good life.
Multi-level marketing.
It's not.
Like, I just got to get you filed in here under me and then I get to heaven faster. That's not the Christian approach at all.
It's a genuine desire for them to live the good life in community and in right relationship. And when taking the Human Rights Campaign, who started in a good place of like, okay, we need to make sure that the Russians are not continuing this persecution of the Jews. That was a big thing that Colson worked on when he was in the White House with Nixon. and I bring up Colson because of everything that he did after he got saved with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Like
Tremendous good
stuff. And now we're saying, well, we need to provide medical abortions to people in developing countries because they don't have access to good health care.
That's their pathway to prosperity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
see, what's
what
the
are we
problem?
doing?
What's holding them back from utopia and progress? Oh, babies. Well,
Yes.
then the babies got to go.
Right. Yep. And it's insanity. And I mean, you compare that with India, right? In what was it, in the 70s with the dwarf wheat, where India was facing this population boom, and there was supposed to be millions of people that were going to die from starvation. And what does Norman Borlaug do? He genetically engineers this wheat to be shorter. It was dwarf wheat, right? So it's heavier yield at the top, shorter stalks, so it doesn't fall over and die. And it saves India, right? Like, this is how India is able to be fed. And where is India at today? They are on the verge of being a thriving democracy. And what is their greatest asset? Their people.
Right.
They are a regional hegemon that defends against China and Chinese aggression.
Yeah.
And they are able to counter the Chinese aggression because of their population, right? So if India had said, well, we're going to have a population boom, we're going to take a one-child policy, right? Or a no-child policy for a period of 15 years, 20 years. How horrific, first off, would that have been on the loss of human life? And then just it's almost unfathomable to think of all of the negative geopolitical problems that would have arisen because of that.
If India had copied China.
Correct.
Right.
Right. And now China's on the other side of it, right? They have this massive population. They're trying to become a world power. They're trying to move outside of that regional hegemonic status. And they're getting ready to face a population crisis, right? Because because the Chinese culture said men are more valuable than women, which was one of the first things that Christianity fought against, right?
Yep.
And we talked about that before, that human rights started with Christianity saying women are equal, right? The egalitarians. And
picking babies off the street.
Yeah,
when they're
absolutely.
being left out to be.
Right, when the Romans said, we'll just leave them in the backyard to die, the Christians went out and collected them.
Yeah.
And so we started there with our human rights. Chinese culture said men are more valuable than women. So these Chinese parents that were having twins or that were going to have more than one baby chose to kill the female baby because they wanted to pass on the male heir.
Right.
So now China has way more men. They can't find partners. They can't find spouses. And it's leading to this cultural crisis. So to say that people are the problem, right, is always the wrong answer.
And yet we inevitably repeat that mistake.
Over and over again because we want to play God, right?
I think it's as simple as, you notice who we say the problem is. It's the people that either we feel are in competition with us, right? Make our lives a little more difficult that way, or the people who place some kind of obligation on us, like the disabled, people who can't help themselves. Anytime we perceive people imposing themselves on us, we react very negatively. Now, sometimes, and this is deep at the core of the American spirit as well, because we felt the king and the parliament imposing their wills on us. And we, as the founders would say, we stood up with manly dignity.
Yes.
And we renounced this oppression.
Right.
Well, that might have its time and place, but we better not be, one-dimensional beings.
Correct.
Who are, merely individualistic to the point that we reject the family because it places moral duties and relational obligations on us.
And to their credit, the founders started with an attempt to reconcile. Right? They started with hey, look.
They were not
we are being mistreated.
Radical individualists at all.
Not in any way, shape, or form. And then, so I think that's important to note. Also, when we're talking about the utopian piece, and you made the comment about how the lefties look at us and say, well, you're opposing utopia. No, like the utopian vision, like America is an aspirational experiment, right?
Yeah.
The work of the Constitution and the work of the founding documents is not done, and it will never be done, right? And that's the core of what, for all of his faults, what MLK preached, and specifically through the Letter to the Birmingham Jail, which is one of the great human rights works of all time. Like, America is an experiment. America is aspirational in nature.
Yeah.
The question is, what are you aspiring to? Are you aspiring to a place of moral virtue and moral good, which is not restrictive, right? When people that are outside of the faith community look at morality, they see something that is overly confining, it's restrictive, it keeps me from being me. And that is the furthest thing from the truth, right? The moral constrictions that faith and that life should, and historic objective truth and natural law put on you, are for your good and for your benefit. And it leads to the good life. It leads to human flourishing, which is what this season is all about, right? It's an understanding that we are subject to nature and to nature's God, and to find ways to live in right relationship.
Well, that's the key word you just said, subject.
Yeah.
We can either exercise our liberty well and for our own good by freely submitting ourselves to the King of Kings, right? The author of truth, the giver of life and freedom, right? And so submission to that is, it's not a it's not a slavery to something that is anything other than our own good.
Yep.
Right? And yet we have difficulty with that because we're fallen beings in a fallen world.
Yeah. And the same people that say, we need to use we need to have family planning for the future, and we need to have this focus on the individual and all of this, the leftist utopian mindset, are the same people who look at the history of the United States and see nothing but a history of oppression. And they're just exchanging oppressors, right? Like, I think one of the best examples of this is the way we look at Native American history. There were some serious abuses on the part of the U.S. government. Absolutely, hands down, without qualification.
Yeah.
But the example that they give is, well, if the United States hadn't done that, then there would have just been peace and harmony, and all of these Indian tribes would have continued to live out their days in this utopia that is America. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? There was already warring, there was already killing, there was consistent tribal conflict. Like, that was not the experience for the vast majority of Native Americans in the U.S.
Right.
And so to say that because of this wrong judgment on our part, we now need to totally obfuscate any future responsibility to do any kind of development like this is insanity, right? You need to learn from those lessons. You need to admit that they were wrong. And then you need to strive to fix that and move forward and continue to reclaim the world, right? Like, that's the Christian call, is to form and fill the earth, right?
Yeah, you're right. And we have to be able to look back honestly.
Yes.
And not just, assign blame to the past. That's too easy.
It's
so easy.
Yeah. It's a cop-out.
It's cheap grandstanding.
Yep.
Right? To try to gain virtue points and moral authority by throwing other dead people under the bus.
Correct.
It's far more beneficial to look at ourselves in the mirror.
Yeah.
And this is, earlier we talked about the problems with ideology.
Right.
It kind of blinds you to a lot of the reality of life because you become fixated kind of hypnotically on your system that you created in your image that you're so impressed with, and in your pride are hell-bent to impose on the world because you're sure that your system will be the answer. The Christian approach is seeking truth with a humble heart. And, as the Old Testament says, what does God ask of you, O man, other than to love mercy and to walk humbly with the Lord your God and to live justly?
Yes.
And in fact, I flipped those around. The first one is walk justly, love mercy, and live in humble relationship with God. If you notice the pattern that gives us, because you might be like, well, is there a tension between loving justice but also loving mercy? How do you do justice if you love mercy? Do you let everyone off the hook? And it's very clearly oriented to, like, you yourself, you do justice, okay? Yeah. Expect the just, the good, the right from yourself. When it comes to your neighbor, they're going to let you down constantly. Yeah. They're sinners. You need to love being merciful whenever possible. Right. and seek to be merciful just as God seeks to be merciful with you. And then the final one is how we relate to God.
Right.
And that only happens through humility, because the minute pride enters the equation, we create our own system and we have our own solutions and our false gospels that we buy into, and we impose on the world through violence.
Yes. And I think that's a really good transition here too, to talk more about the institution, right? So when I think the couple of contextual things here, I think and you may disagree with me on this because we haven't talked about it. If you do, please do. I think the Anglican and the Orthodox religions in general, the Orthodox, not religions, the Orthodox
Branches of the church.
Yeah.
Traditions.
There you go.
Communions.
Yes. In general, do a great job of acting as an institution, right? Like you are like...
Because the institution exists.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you're not Spencer Amaral, pastor. Like you fill the role of priest.
Head of Spencer Amaral Ministries.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. You fill that institutional role of priest here, but it's not about you. It's a recognition that the office is what's important and that you are subject to that office, right? Same thing should be true in the institution of government, right? If you're an elected representative, you were not there as Joe Smith. Well, that was meant to be a random name, but that's the name of my neighbor. But you're not there as Joe Smith.
Sorry, Joe Smith.
Yeah, sorry, Joe. You're the best. Seriously, great neighbor. You're not there as an individual. You are there as the representative for that district,
right?
Whatever that district is, right? And therefore, you should act in a way that's in accordance with that institutional responsibility, right? You are a placeholder. It's the same thing with our presidents, with our senators. They are not like Joe Biden should have an understanding that he is not there as Joe Biden, leader of the free world. He is filling the place of the president of the United States, leader of the free world, right? And that tomorrow that person will be different, whether that's actually tomorrow or 4 years from now or whatever. Like his time will come and there's somebody else will step into that role and fill that institutional void. And when we have a bureaucracy that's made up of individuals that have no accountability, that have no sense of historical understanding of their place and their role and what their job is, then that bureaucracy breaks down, right? And as much as I hate to give credit to the big government the big government socialist that he was, but FDR was able to accomplish great things through organizations like the TVA. And like, look at the Grand Coulee Dam, the Hoover Dam, like these massive infrastructure projects, right? Take the Library of Congress. Library of Congress was finished, I think it's like $3 million under budget and 5 years ahead of time by the Army Corps of Engineers. When was the last time the Army Corps of Engineers did anything early and on budget or under budget? Much less, like, it's just insane. But it's because those people that
not
were
a
functioning...
spotless record.
No, not at all.
But to the extent that those programs were successful, it reflects a different culture.
Correct. The people that were doing the work understood, I am not working for myself.
Right.
I am working for, this is going to sound communist, but for the glory and edification of the United States.
Glory of the empire.
Yes, right? Because they were building an institution. They were building something that they knew would outlast them.
They're acting with a sense of purpose.
Correct.
And there's nobility in that.
Yes,
it brings
there is.
the best out of us.
Absolutely it does.
Would you rather, I mean, you see both sides of this in, war movies. You see soldiers, right? Some join up because they had nothing better to do or they're running from the law, and this was an easy out of prison, right? So you join the military. And then you have the other guy that signs up because he believes in the cause and he's genuinely ready to jump on a grenade to protect the guys around him. Which one would you rather have as your neighbor? Which one would you rather have as your local police officer, your firefighter, your mayor, your member of Congress? Yeah. It should be the more noble one. And yet today our culture is so steeped in this cynicism that I don't think we're even we're aware of the corruption and the problems. But if we're not aware that the solution is in leaning into a deep love of the place in which God has placed you, and working for the genuine well-being of that city and that community, Chesterton has a great bit on this. just talking about the love that you have for your place, your community. If you don't love it, who will?
Yes.
But furthermore, like how does it become more lovable? He makes such a good point. The only way that you actually make a place or a thing or a person more lovable is by loving it.
Yep. Like Lewis.
Choosing to love it.
Yeah, like Lewis says, just act like you love them and you will. You'll find
Yes, and you know what? You draw them into a relationship that brings the best out of them, and you are definitely walking more Christ-like, right? So it brings the best out of you. To choose to love something, it's not naive love. It's not a blind kind of pretending there's something they're not.
Right.
It's rather looking at the world as it is and saying, look, how do I contribute positively here?
Right.
Is there a better direction to go, and how do I begin taking baby steps in that direction? And not just alone and being like, screw all this, I'm gonna ditch it, but rather trying to reach out and bring some of the people around you along with you. If we don't love our community enough to do that, and we just disengage,
Right.
again, that can seem very tempting all the time. That has to be the absolute last resort. Because once you disengage from that, you've kind of checked out from life in general.
Right.
And you're no longer contributing or fighting the good fight. You're just like trying to survive. And that's not much of a human existence.
It's terrible. It's miserable. And that's what I think a lot of the folks that are in these government jobs today feel, right? Yeah. They may have started with that desire to help, desire to do well, and then they get into the bureaucracy, and then they start saying, okay, well, now I have to protect my job. Like, now I have to conform to whatever it is that's coming down the line because I want to make sure that I can keep my pension. And they lose this sense of purpose and this sense of responsibility for the position that they are filling for a time that will outlast them. Because institutions outlast individuals always, right? And the question is, if you're involved in an institution, how are you going to leave it? Are you going to leave it better than you found it, or are you going to leave it worse off because you were there?
Right. I think this is a really good practical signifier. I find it far more damaging to the soul and to society in general for people to adopt this coping mechanism of, I'm so miserable in this place that I check out mentally and I kill the voice within me that is screaming out about all of the corruption and the problems that I'm surrounded by. So I just find a way to numb that and pretend it's okay and bide my time until I get out.
Yep.
That is soul crushing versus, look at Christ in the incarnation. The Son of God takes on our flesh, walks among us, right? All the implications of that are so mind-blowing and beyond our ability to even fathom truly. Right. But at the very least, it tells us it's far better to look squarely into the face of the abyss before you. See it with all its warts, all of its problems, and be utterly truthful about that, and yet do not respond with superiority, disdain, but rather respond incarnationally and say, how do I love this thing as it is, and try to nudge this thing in the right direction.
Right.
That it's a purposeful approach to life. It's a truth-oriented approach to life. It's a positive approach to life. It's the opposite of soul crushing. I would say, even if you're in a setting like that where you're constantly fighting an uphill battle and you feel like you're losing day in and day out, your soul is so much healthier. Yes. And God is training up a whole set of muscles in you that you didn't know you had. And he's going to use those in incredible ways, either in that season or in the next. Even when we don't understand it, and even when it feels like we're losing left and right. Yeah,
that's really good. That's really good. I think too. Let's revisit a little bit the divide between theocracy and a Christian influenced form of government, right? So kind of the example that we've been using for this series was Kuyper and his view of sphere sovereignty, and how he was he was an ordained minister. And then when he became prime minister, he gave up his ordination for that season of his life because he believed that they needed to be separate institutions. But they are obviously very much influenced by each other. Scripture shows us that Israel didn't have a king. They were being led directly by God and by prophets. They said that they looked around. They saw that everybody else had a king. They said that they wanted one too. God said, "Are you sure about that?" And Israel, in their ignorance, said yes. And so then he gave them Saul. And the line of Jewish kings began. And then in the New Testament, we see that Jesus comes not as a earthly king, right? His kingdom was not of this world.
Right.
And his focus was on the individual. It was on your faith, on you coming into right relationship with him, redeeming the individual, redeeming the person, and fulfilling all that he needed to do to take on our sin, right? So there's two different examples here. There's the example in the Old Testament of a physical king being given by God. And in the New Testament, there's the example of a in the corporate environment in which we worship. I hate to use the term individual, but the focus is on the person, not on
That's fine.
the country,
I know what you mean.
Right? So talk a little bit about the idea of why those two examples are different, and kind of how the example of Christ should influence our example of government, and why we should be looking for a Christian influenced government, not a Christian government.
I think deep in people's bones, they want a Christ-like government. Even if we don't ever say that. The most obvious thing that jumps to my mind is our view of leadership and authority.
Yes.
Right? Jesus flips the paradigm on its head. Leaders don't serve to glorify themselves. Right? They don't. That's not the point of their office. Now, in the Roman Empire, like absolutely. How do you magnify the glory of the empire? By magnifying your own glory, because those two things are one and the same. And Jesus says, nope. The greatest is the one who leads by serving and sacrificing himself first, who offers himself for all, and pours himself out. And of course, he lives that out and perfectly.
Right.
So that's what we want in our leaders. We don't want narcissistic egomaniacs. We want humble people that we can trust, that genuinely seek the well-being of others. We want Jesus. Okay. Well, the good news is he is king.
Right.
And we ought to try to reflect him and imitate him all the days of our lives. And the best part of the democratic process is, like, we can theoretically sort through society and select the ones who are most Christ-like, right? In terms of most genuinely intent on loving their neighbor, not just enriching themselves.
Right.
So Jesus really displays the otherworldliness of the kingdom of heaven and the way in which God is a good shepherd to his people. And he shows that by laying his life down for them. The sacrificial component of this is huge.
Right.
You know, we have a lot of impulses in this direction, even like, the impulses towards term limits and limiting how much money elected officials can make, because we know we don't want people to be in this for their own personal gain.
Right.
We want them to be in it for the people that they are swearing to defend and serve. And that's utterly Christian.
Right.
Utterly New Testament. Utterly Jesus centered, which is good. I wish we said that more often.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think we'll probably wrap up and leave it here for this episode. We'll come back and revisit a few of these thoughts in a second part to the government piece, and maybe touch on some more specifics on right roles and functions, and get a little more nitty gritty. But it's been really good.
It has been.
Yeah.
You want to save the conversation about how to deal with different traditions of thought and hermeneutics, and
Yeah,
that's a whole other thing. We'll save that.
It is. That's very good. It is needed.
I think, yeah, because how do you reasonably and humbly and honestly approach the diversity
Yeah.
of thought, even among people who are not nihilists? They do have a conception of God, and they're trying to seek him and know him and serve him the best they can. It's not like all those people are on the same page. So how do you handle that? What's the role of pluralism? That'll be a great way to follow up on this.
Yeah.
Especially in the American context, because we've been wrestling with all those questions as a society for hundreds of years now.
Agreed. No, that'll be really good. I think you might have just outlined our season summary episode.
Good.
That sounds great. Thanks for the time today. Let's bring
Thanks,
in some
Bryce.
lunch.
Love that.
Hey everybody, this is Bryce Futch, host and creator of the Way Forward podcast, and I wanted to take a minute and tell you about our sponsor for Season 2, Stand for Georgia Values Political Action Committee. They exist to ensure that every vote in Georgia is an informed vote, providing clear, concise, and accurate information about the issues and candidates shaping our future. They do some incredible work finding phenomenal candidates at a local level throughout North Georgia, and then also doing some work across the state as well. But you can find out more information about them at standforgeorgiavaluespac.com. We're incredibly grateful to have them as a sponsor. Like I said, not only have they sponsored season 2, but they're going to continue to sponsor the podcast moving forward. So hopefully you'll be getting some more regular content from us. Be on the lookout for that next month. We're very excited for what is to come on the way forward. Full disclosure, I do serve as their executive director of that organization and their partnered 501c3 Stand for Georgia Values Foundation. But thanks again to Stand for Georgia Values PAC for their sponsorship. Please check out their website and be involved with them so that they can continue to support the work that we do here at The Way Forward. Thanks for listening.